April 14th, 1947, 11:23 a.m., a village outside Münster, Westphalia. The knock came soft, too soft for authority. The women inside the farmhouse froze, spoons mid-stir, breath held, eyes locked on the door. Knocking in 1947 meant bills, requisitions, news of the dead. It never meant mercy. But the man on the other side was already removing his cap, shifting his weight from one polished boot to the other, rehearsing an apology in a language he barely spoke. When the door finally cracked open, they saw him, tall, lean, unmistakably British. Uniform pressed, hands empty. Not a conqueror, a visitor. They braced for demands. The first word they heard was, "Please." The eldest woman, Margaret, gripped the doorframe. Her sister stepped back. A child peeked from behind a chair. The air between them thickened with disbelief. British soldiers did not return. Not to apologise, not to say thank you, not to a village they had occupied 2 years prior, where every man was dead or missing, where hunger was a daily arithmetic, where shame and suspicion were the only crops left to harvest. And yet here he stood, this captain from Yorkshire, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine, his face open, almost boyish, the kind of face that had no place in the wreckage of post-war Germany. "I was here," he said slowly, in fractured German. "In 1945, you gave me water." Margaret's hand went to her throat. She remembered. Of course she remembered. Every small mercy was catalogued in memory now, every moment of restraint or cruelty, every exchange that could mean survival or ruin. But soldiers did not remember such things. Soldiers moved on. They did not come back to say thank you. They did not come back at all. "You came back," she whispered. He nodded. "I came back." The scene was impossible, but it was also true. Captain Geoffrey Dalton, 34th Infantry Brigade, had returned to the same farmhouse where, on May 9th, 1945, in the last chaotic week of the European War, a group of German women had offered him and his men water from a well, bread from a hidden store, and directions to the nearest bridge still standing. They had done so without expectation, without fanfare, in the muted tones of people who had long stopped hoping for anything in return. And Dalton, a schoolteacher before the war, a man who kept a notebook in his breast pocket and wrote down the names of every village he passed through, had remembered. He had written it down. And when the war ended, when the occupation settled into routine, when he was rotated home and demobbed and returned to a classroom in Leeds, he could not forget. So in the spring of 1947, when travel restrictions loosened and the British zone allowed limited civilian movement, he returned. With chocolates, with tins of tea, with a letter painstakingly drafted in halting German explaining that he had not forgotten their kindness, that small gestures mattered, that he wanted them to know, if this moment already changed how you see. The war, subscribe. The next will surprise you even more. Geoffrey Dalton had not expected to survive the war. Few infantrymen did. He had landed in Normandy on June 8, 1944, 2 days after D-Day, wading through surf thick with debris and bodies, the air sour with cordite and salt. His company pushed east through hedgerows and shattered villages, fighting house to house, barn to barn, losing men to snipers and mortars and mines. By the time they crossed into Germany in March 1945, half his platoon was gone. The rest were hollow-eyed, moving on instinct, no longer soldiers so much as survivors of their own endurance. They had been told what to expect in Germany. Fanaticism, resistance, booby traps, civilians loyal to the regime, capable of anything. And in some places, they found exactly that. In others, they found exhaustion. Women too tired to hate, children too hungry to care, old men who handed over weapons without a word and shuffled back inside. The war had passed through these villages like a flood, leaving only mud and silence. The transport into the British zone was slow, methodical, nothing like the chaos of the advance. By May 1945, the fighting was over, but the occupation had only just begun. Dalton's brigade moved through Westphalia in long convoys and trucks grinding over cratered roads, past fields pocked with shell holes, past farmhouses with walls blown open like dollhouses. The air smelled of wet ash and turned earth. In every town, white flags hung from windows, bedsheets, pillowcases, anything pale enough to signal surrender. They bivouacked outside Münster in a cluster of villages that had been bombed, occupied and abandoned in quick succession. The civilians who remained were mostly women. The men were dead, captured or still missing in the east. The children were silent, watchful, old before their time. Dalton's orders were simple: maintain order, prevent looting, secure supplies, and above all, do no harm. The British Army had a policy, drilled into every officer from the first days of occupation. Prisoners were soldiers, not slaves. Civilians were to be treated with discipline and restraint. Vengeance was not policy. Civilization, even under pressure, was. The farmhouse where Dalton's unit stopped that afternoon in May had a well in the courtyard, still functional, still clear. His men were thirsty. They had been on the road since dawn, and the water in their canteens was warm and metallic. Dalton knocked. Margaret answered, flanked by her sister and a neighbour. They did not smile. They did not speak. But when Dalton asked politely in his schoolboy German if they might draw water from the well, Margaret nodded. And then, after a moment's hesitation, she brought out bread. Not much. A half loaf, dense and dark, the kind baked from whatever grain was left. She set it on the stone lip of the well without a word. Dalton thanked her. His men drank. They did not linger. They moved on, but Dalton wrote it down. He always wrote it down. The pivot came later, in that first quiet evening after the surrender, when the world seemed to pause and take stock of itself. Dalton sat on the hood of a jeep, his notebook open, trying to make sense of the day. Around him, his men smoked and talked in low voices, their relief tinged with something heavier. The weight of what came next. Occupation. Reconstruction. Justice. The machinery of peace was more complicated than the machinery of war. One of the younger soldiers, a private named Harris, approached him. "Sir," he said, "did you see the way she looked at us? Like we might shoot her for the bread?" Dalton nodded. He had seen it. The fear was instinctive, animal. It was the look of people who had learned to expect the worst. "We're not them," Harris said quietly. "We're not the bloody SS." "No," Dalton agreed. "We're not." But the distinction, he knew, was fragile. It had to be maintained every day, in every interaction, with discipline and deliberate restraint. Civilization was not a given. It was a choice, repeated over and over in moments so small they barely registered. A knocked door instead of a kicked one. A question instead of a command. A thank you where none was required. "They expected wolves," he wrote that night. "We gave them soldiers. It is the least we can do. It is also the most." Behind every act of restraint was a structure, invisible but unyielding. The British War Office had issued directives as early as 1940, long before the tide of war turned, anticipating the day when Allied forces would occupy enemy territory. The language was blunt. Prisoners of war were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Civilians were to be protected, not punished. Officers who failed to enforce these standards would be court-martialed. The policy was not born of sentiment. It was strategic, reciprocity, diplomacy, morality, security, diplomacy, morality. The three principles were inseparable. A soldier who abused civilians undermined the occupation. A camp that mistreated prisoners invited retaliation. And an army that abandoned its principles became indistinguishable from the enemy it sought to defeat. So the rules were strict, and the enforcement was real. Dalton had seen officers reprimanded for allowing their men to loot. He had seen supplies redirected to feed German children when British rations were stretched thin. It was not mercy, it was policy. But in practice, the two often looked the same. Daily life in the occupied zones settled into a rhythm. Dalton's unit was reassigned to a requisitioned manor outside the village, where they oversaw distribution of Red Cross parcels, coordinated with local officials, and maintained a tenuous peace. The women of the village came to them with problems: a roof that needed repair, a well that had run dry, a dispute over firewood. Dalton listened. He mediated. He assigned work details, his own men, not forced labour, to fix what could be fixed. Slowly the fear began to ebb. Not trust, not yet, but something quieter. Coexistence. The children were the first to soften. A boy named Klaus, maybe 7 years old, started appearing near the motor pool, watching the mechanics work. One of the soldiers, a corporal named MacLeod, showed him how to check tyre pressure. Another gave him a piece of chocolate. Real chocolate, not the ersatz powder the Germans had been eating for years. Klaus's eyes went wide. He took it carefully, as if it might vanish, and ran. The next day, he brought his sister. By the end of the week, there were half a dozen children orbiting the camp like cautious satellites drawn by curiosity and hunger, and the strange, undeniable fact that these foreign soldiers did not shout, did not strike, did not take. Margaret watched from a distance. She did not approve, not exactly, but she did not stop them either. Survival required flexibility, and these men, whatever else they were not cruel. There were 4 men whose stories Dalton recorded in detail, each a small window into the architecture of restraint. Private First Class William Brennan, a medic from Liverpool, treated a woman named Ingrid for an infected hand. She had cut it on barbed wire while scavenging in a bombed-out barn. The infection had spread, red lines climbing her forearm. Brennan cleaned it, applied sulfur powder, wrapped it in gauze, and told her to come back in 2 days. She did. And when the infection cleared, she brought him eggs. 3 of them, wrapped in cloth, an offering so small and so enormous that Brennan could not speak. He wrote in his journal, "She gave me eggs. I saved her hand. We are even now. I think that is how peace begins." Sergeant Arthur Mills, a joiner from Kent, repaired the roof of the schoolhouse. It had been damaged in an air raid the previous autumn, and the children had spent the winter in a church basement, crammed together, learning by candlelight. Mills requisitioned timber and nails from the supply depot, organised a work crew, and finished the job in 3 days. When the schoolteacher, Frau Weber, tried to thank him, he shrugged. "Kids need a roof," he said. That was all. She cried anyway. Corporal James Finch, a clerk from Brighton, wrote letters for the illiterate. Many of the older women could not read or write, and the chaos of war had separated families across continents. Finch sat at a folding table in the village square every Tuesday and Thursday, transcribing letters to sons in Soviet POW camps, brothers missing in France, husbands presumed dead. He charged nothing. He asked for nothing. He simply wrote. "If words are all I have to give," he noted, "then I will give them freely." And then there was Lance Corporal Peter Goff, a factory worker from Manchester who played harmonica. On warm evenings he sat outside the manor and played folk songs, hymns, dance tunes, anything that came to mind. The music carried across the fields, soft and unhurried, and the villagers began to gather. Not close, not openly, but near enough to listen. One night an old man began to hum along, then a woman joined, then another. The war had stolen their voices. The music gave them back. Ideology was a harder thing to dismantle than infrastructure. The women of the village had been told for 12 years that the British were degenerate, cowardly, racially inferior, that they would rape and pillage and burn. That surrender meant annihilation. And yet here they were, these British soldiers, fixing roofs and writing letters and playing harmonica. The contradiction was unbearable. And so, slowly, the propaganda began to crack. One afternoon, Margaret approached Dalton. She held a photograph in her hands, creased and faded. It showed a young man in Wehrmacht uniform smiling, his arm around a woman who was unmistakably her, 20 years younger. "My husband," she said. "He was killed in Russia, 1943. Dalton looked at the photo. He did not know what to say, so he said the only thing that felt true. "I'm sorry," she nodded. "You lost men too." "Yes." She folded the photograph carefully and placed it back in her apron pocket. "The war was a lie," she said quietly. "All of it. We were told you were monsters, but you are just men. Tired men. Like ours." Dalton thought of the villages he had passed through, the faces in the rubble, the silence of the dead. "Yes," he said, "just men. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more." Christmas 1945 came cold and clear. The village had no decorations, no tree, no candles to spare. But the British garrison organised a meal. Modest by pre-war standards, extravagant by the measure of 1945. Tinned meat, potatoes, bread, apples from the officers' stores. They invited the villagers, and after much hesitation, a few came. Margaret, Frau Weber, Klaus and his sister, the old man who hummed. There was no speech, no ceremony, just food shared at rough-hewn tables in the manor's great hall under a ceiling stained with soot and water damage. Corporal MacLeod played a record on a hand-cranked phonograph, Bing Crosby, White Christmas, and the children listened, transfixed, as if hearing music for the first time. At one point, Margaret leaned toward Dalton. "Why do you do this?" she asked. He considered the question. "Because it is right," he said, "and because we will all have to live together when this is over." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for remembering that we are still here." By May 1946, Dalton was rotated home. His war was over. He returned to Leeds, to his classroom, to the familiar rhythms of chalk and lesson plans and boys who had been too young to fight. But the village stayed with him. The faces, the well, the bread, the photograph. He thought of Margaret often, wondered if she had survived the winter, if Klaus was still alive, if the schoolhouse roof still held. And so, in the spring of 1947, he went back. He took a train to the Hook of Holland, a ferry to Hamburg, another train south into the British zone. He carried a parcel: tea, chocolates, soap, a few tins of corned beef. Small things, practical things, the kind of things that mattered when nothing else did. When Margaret opened the door and saw him, she covered her mouth with both hands. "You came back," she said, her voice breaking. "I came back," he confirmed. She stepped aside, and he entered. The farmhouse was cleaner now, less desperate. The walls had been patched, the floor swept. There was a pot of soup on the stove, thin but fragrant. Klaus appeared from a back room, taller, more confident, and stared at Dalton with undisguised astonishment. "The captain," he said. "Just Geoffrey now," Dalton corrected gently. They sat. They drank tea, real tea from Dalton's parcel, and talked about the village, about the harvest, about the men who had not returned. Margaret told him that Frau Weber had died in January pneumonia, but the school was still open, that Corporal Finch's letters had reached a son in a Soviet camp, and he had written back, alive, that the children still remembered the chocolate. "Why did you come back?" Margaret asked, echoing her question from Christmas 2 years prior. Dalton thought of the notebook in his pocket, filled with names and places and small acts of decency that had held the world together when everything else fell apart. "Because you gave me water," he said, "and I wanted you to know that I remembered." She looked at him, and for the first time since he had known her, she smiled. Not a polite smile, a real one. "We are not used to being remembered," she said softly. "Thank you." After the war, thousands of German civilians wrote to former Allied soldiers, expressing gratitude for moments of restraint, for kindness in the midst of occupation, for the discipline that kept humanity alive when it would have been easier to abandon it. Many soldiers responded. Some returned. The exchanges were quiet, personal, and almost never publicized. They were not propaganda. They were simply what happened when people chose to see each other as human beings rather than symbols. By 1950, Dalton had visited the village 3 more times. He brought books for the school, seeds for the gardens, letters from Brennan and Mills and Finch, who had also kept in touch. Klaus grew into a young man, studied engineering, and eventually moved to Hamburg. Margaret lived into her 80s, and when she died, she left Dalton a letter written in careful English. "You showed us that even in war, decency is a choice. Thank you for choosing it." He kept the letter in his notebook alongside the entry from May 1945. 2 pages, 2 worlds, the same truth. If you've been moved by this story of restraint and remembrance, subscribe and share it, because the hardest battles are often fought with the smallest gestures and the ones we remember. Longest are the ones where mercy won. On April 14th, 1947, at 11:23 in the morning, a man knocked on a door in a village outside Münster. He carried a parcel and a memory. The woman who answered had carried a fear for 2 years, the fear that no one remembered, that the small kindnesses of war were erased by its vast cruelties. But he had remembered, and in remembering, he had returned. The knock was soft. The word was, "Please." And when the door opened, what passed between them was not forgiveness. Neither owed the other that, but recognition. They had met once, in the worst of times, and chosen restraint over rage. And now, in the fragile peace, they met again, not as enemies, but as witnesses to the same truth. That civilization is not what survives a war, but what people choose to rebuild, one gesture at a time. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them memory.